Once you step into the headmaster's office on a night when even the portraits pretend to sleep, and immediately you notice something the morning visitors never see. Albus Dumbledore's hands are shaking as he reaches for a photograph he keeps hidden behind a false panel in his desk. A photograph of a girl with wide, frightened eyes who looks nothing like the confident wizard the world celebrates. And you realize with a cold clarity that everything you thought you knew about the greatest wizard of the age is about to unravel like a poorly cast charm. The photograph shows Ariana Dumbledore at 14, just months before her death, and the way Albus's fingers trace her face tells you this isn't nostalgia, but something darker, something closer to penance, and you understand now why he never speaks of her in his speeches, why her name appears in no biographical accounts, why even the chocolate frog cards that made him famous make no mention of the sister who died under mysterious circumstances in 1899. You settle into the visitor's chair without being invited because something tells you this story requires sitting down, and Dumbledore doesn't object, doesn't even seem to notice you're there as he stares at that photograph with eyes that have seen far too much. And you think about how historians always focus on his later triumphs while conveniently glossing over the fact that he spent his 19th summer plotting world domination with a dark wizard. But we'll get to that part later because first, you need to understand what happened to Ariana. What really happened, not the sanitized version the ministry approved for public consumption. The night air through the open window carries the scent of the forbidden forest, and you can hear the distant howl of something that might be a werewolf or might be a student who didn't read the warning signs. Which reminds you that Hogwarts has always had a peculiar relationship with safety regulations, much like how Victorian England had a peculiar relationship with child labor laws, employing children as young as 5 in coal mines until the Mines Act of 1842. Finally said perhaps sending toddlers into collapsing tunnels wasn't the brightest idea. Dumbledore finally speaks, and his voice has none of the grandfatherly twinkle you're expecting, none of the theatrical warmth he uses when addressing the Great Hall. Instead, it's flat and exhausted and anciently sad as he tells you that Ariana was 6 years old when 3 Muggle boys saw her doing magic, saw her making flowers dance in the garden of their home in Mold on the Wold, and what those boys did to her, the attack they perpetrated, left her psychologically shattered and unable to control her magic ever again. You lean forward because this part never made it into Dumbledore, a biography, never made it past Rita Skeeter's sensationalist lens, and you realize you're hearing something that perhaps a dozen people in the world know the full truth about. And Dumbledore explains that Ariana's magic turned inward after the attack, became a parasitic force that would build and build inside her until it exploded outward in violent, uncontrollable bursts that destroyed furniture, shattered windows, once nearly brought down an entire wall of their cottage. His father, Percival Dumbledore, tracked down those 3 Muggle boys and attacked them in retaliation. And here's where the historical record gets interesting, because the ministry tried Percival in 1891, sentenced him to Azkaban where he died years later, but they never revealed what he'd done to deserve such a harsh sentence, never explained that he'd been protecting his daughter, and you wonder if perhaps the wizarding justice system of the 1890s was as corrupt and image-obsessed as the ministry you've seen in your own time. The family moved to Godric's Hollow shortly after, seeking anonymity, seeking a place where nobody knew about Ariana's condition, and Dumbledore's mother Kendra took on the full burden of caring for her damaged daughter while young Albus escaped to Hogwarts, where he could pretend his home life wasn't a slowly unfolding tragedy, which strikes you as painfully familiar because don't we all sometimes use achievement as a way to avoid dealing with family trauma? Much like how Sigmund Freud spent years developing psychoanalysis to avoid confronting his own complicated relationship with his mother, or at least that's what some scholars suggest, though others argue Freud's theories had more to do with Victorian sexual repression than maternal issues. You watch as Dumbledore pours himself a glass of something that smells vaguely like fire whiskey, but probably isn't because he's never been much of a drinker, at least not since the summer of 1899, and he admits that he resented his mother during his Hogwarts years, resented having to come home for holidays when he could have been traveling or studying or making a name for himself, resented that his brilliant future seemed contingent on his family's dark secret remaining hidden, and you can hear the self-loathing in his voice as he describes his younger self, this arrogant prodigy who won every academic prize Hogwarts offered, who corresponded with the most prominent magical theorists of his age, who published papers on alchemy and transfiguration before he'd even graduated. The portraits on the walls are definitely awake now. You can see their painted eyes tracking the conversation, and you notice that Phineas Nigellus Black looks particularly interested, which makes sense because he was headmaster during Dumbledore's student years and probably remembers the golden boy everyone expected would become Minister of Magic before age 30. Though, of course, that's not what happened because fate and poor choices and a dead sister have a way of derailing even the most promising trajectories. Dumbledore graduated in 1899, the same year his mother died, and here's where you need to pay attention because the timeline matters, the exact sequence of events matters. And the fact that scholars still debate what actually happened that summer tells you something about how carefully Dumbledore has guarded his secrets. He came home from Hogwarts planning to leave immediately on a world tour with his friend Albus Dumbledore, planning to visit Egypt and Greece and observe foreign magical practices, planning basically to do anything except stay in Godric's Hollow, taking care of his damaged sister. But 2 days before departure, his mother died in an explosion of Ariana's magic, an accident everyone agreed was tragic but unavoidable. And suddenly, 18-year-old Albus Dumbledore found himself trapped. The plans he'd made turned to ash, just like the east wall of the cottage where the explosion occurred. You can see how this memory cuts him even now, more than a century later. The way he flinches slightly when he mentions canceling the trip explains how he wrote to Doge with the news. Tried to sound noble and resigned when really he was furious. Furious at his mother for dying, furious at Ariana for being damaged, furious at his father for attacking those Muggle boys and getting himself imprisoned, furious at the entire universe for conspiring to ruin his brilliant future. And you think that at least he's honest about what an absolutely terrible person he was at 18, which is more self-awareness than most people manage. His younger brother Aberforth was 16 then, still at Hogwarts, and Dumbledore admits they fought constantly that summer, fought about who would take care of Ariana, fought about Albus's obvious resentment, fought about the fact that Aberforth actually loved their sister unconditionally, while Albus saw her primarily as an obligation, and you realize you're witnessing the origin story of a family feud that never truly healed, that continues even now in the cold politeness between the Hogwarts headmaster and the Hog's head barkeeper. Then Gellert Grindelwald arrived, and everything got exponentially worse, but also in some ways better, at least temporarily, because suddenly Albus had someone who understood his intellectual ambitions, someone who wasn't from Godric's Hollow, someone who looked at him and saw genius rather than the frustrated caretaker of a mentally ill sister. And you can hear something dangerous creep into Dumbledore's voice when he mentions Grindelwald's name. Something that sounds suspiciously like longing, even after all these years, even after everything that happened. You've heard about Grindelwald, of course. Everyone has. The dark wizard who nearly conquered Europe in the 1940s, who built the prison Nurthnengard to house his enemies, who believed in wizard supremacy and the subjugation of Muggles, who Dumbledore finally defeated in 1945 in what historians call the greatest duel ever witnessed. But what you didn't know, what most people don't know, is that Grindelwald was Dumbledore's age exactly, born the same year, brilliant in the same ways, and that they met that terrible summer when both were 18 and raw with ambition and convinced they were destined for greatness. Grindelwald had been expelled from Durmstrang, Dumbledore explains, expelled for conducting dangerous experiments that nearly killed several students, which really should have been a warning sign but instead just made him seem more exciting, more transgressive, more like the kind of person who wasn't bound by conventional thinking. And you think about how many disastrous relationships start exactly this way, with someone mistaking red flags for interesting personality quirks, much like how some historians initially praised Mussolini for making Italian trains run on time, completely missing the whole fascism problem until it was way too late. Grindelwald's great-aunt, Bathilda Bagshot, lived in Godric's Hollow, the famous magical historian whose books you probably studied at school, and he was staying with her for the summer, ostensibly to lie low after the Durmstrang incident, but really to pursue his research into the Deathly Hallows, a pursuit that you'll learn more about later, but which basically involved obsessing over fairy tales and believing they contained actual historical truth, which some scholars argue was a reasonable position given that the tales of Beetle the Bard do seem to reference real magical artifacts, while other scholars suggest Grindelwald was simply experiencing the magical equivalent of conspiracy theory brain rot. You watch Dumbledore's face as he describes meeting Grindelwald for the first time, meeting him at Bathilda's house over tea and biscuits, and you can see something almost like happiness flash across his features before being crushed under layers of guilt and regret. And he admits that those first few weeks were the happiest of his life, that for the first time, someone matched his intellect, challenged his theories, pushed him to think bigger and bolder. And more than that, someone found his situation sympathetic rather than pathetic. Someone who listened to his complaints about being trapped in Godric's Hollow and agreed it was a terrible waste of his talents. They spent every day together that summer, Dumbledore continues, meeting early in the morning and talking until late at night, discussing magical theory and politics and philosophy, and you realize this is the part he's been building up to, the part that makes him most ashamed. Because what they discussed wasn't just academic abstraction, but concrete plans, actual strategies for what they called the greater good, which is perhaps the most dangerous phrase in any language because it can justify absolutely anything if you're willing to define greater and good loosely enough. The greater good, as Grindelwald and young Dumbledore conceived it, meant wizards ruling muggles openly, meant ending the international statute of secrecy, meant creating a new world order with themselves at the top, benevolent philosopher kings who would guide both magical and non-magical peoples into a new age. And when Dumbledore recounts this now, his voice is thick with self-loathing because he knows exactly how Nazi it sounds, knows exactly what road is paved with intentions that claim to be working for everyone's benefit. You lean back in your chair, processing this, trying to reconcile the Dumbledore you thought you knew with this arrogant 18-year-old who seriously considered enslaving muggles for their own good, and you realize that everyone has a past they're not proud of. Everyone has believed terrible things they later recognized as terrible, and maybe the difference between Dumbledore and Grindelwald isn't that one was inherently good and one inherently evil, but that one of them eventually recognized their shared ideology was monstrous, while the other never did. The portraits are definitely judging now. You can see Armando Dippet shaking his head, and Dumbledore notices too, gives them a tired look that suggests they've had this conversation before, probably many times, and you wonder what it's like to have your past mistakes literally watching you from the walls, unable to be forgotten or escaped, which is either the perfect penance or the perfect torture, depending on your perspective. Here's one of those light jokes the situation desperately needs. You ask if all headmasters have to confess their darkest secrets to random visitors, or if you're just lucky and Dumbledore actually smiles slightly, says that most headmasters have the good sense to die before their secrets become too heavy to carry alone. But he's always been terrible at knowing when to make a graceful exit, and you appreciate that even in confession, he maintains some ability to mock himself. The scholarly debates around this period focus on several key questions, Dumbledore explains, almost as if he's delivering a lecture now rather than a confession, and you can see him slip into professor mode, which is probably more comfortable than the raw honesty of a moment. A go. And he outlines how historians argue about whether he and Grindelwald actually planned to find the Deathly Hallows together, whether they seriously intended to implement their wizard supremacy ideology, or were just engaging in the kind of theoretical exercises young intellectuals often pursue without real commitment, and whether his feelings for Grindelwald were purely intellectual or something more complicated, something romantic, something that adds another layer of tragedy to everything that happened. You notice he doesn't directly answer any of these questions, just presents them as scholarly debates, which is a neat trick for avoiding personal revelation while seeming to be open. And you wonder if he's been practicing this maneuver for decades, or if it's just instinctive at this point, this ability to hide in plain sight, to confess without truly confessing, much like how politicians answer questions by talking extensively while saying nothing of substance. A skill perfected in Britain's House of Commons, where members can speak for hours without ever addressing the actual question posed. But then he surprises you by admitting that yes, he was in love with Grindelwald, or thought he was, or maybe actually was, because at 18, who can tell the difference between intellectual infatuation and romantic love? And more importantly, he believed Grindelwald loved him back, believed they were partners in every sense, destined to reshape the world together. And you realize this makes everything so much worse, so much more painful, because what happened next wasn't just the end of a friendship or a political alliance, but the death of something intimate, something that probably felt like it justified the isolation and frustration of his circumstances. They plan to leave together, Dumbledore says, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper now. Plan to abandon Godric's Hollow and Ariana and responsibility and everything else. Plan to begin their quest for the Deathly Hallows, which Grindelwald was convinced would make them unstoppable, would give them the power to implement their vision of a wizard-ruled world, and Dumbledore was ready to do it, ready to leave his damaged sister in his younger brother's care, ready to finally pursue the greatness he'd been promised since childhood. You can see where this is going, but you let him tell it anyway, because this is clearly something he needs to say, needs to speak aloud, even though it destroys him to do so. And he describes the day they plan to leave, describes packing his trunk, describes the excitement and anticipation and terrible selfish joy of escape, and then describes Aberforth confronting them. Aberforth, who was home from Hogwarts, who had discovered their plans, who was absolutely furious that Albus intended to abandon Ariana after everything she'd been through. The fight that followed is what Dumbledore calls the worst day of his life, worse than any duel with dark wizards, worse than any of the wars he later fought, because it ended with Ariana dead and no one sure who cast the spell that killed her, and you watch his hands shake worse now as he describes 3 people dueling in that cottage, himself and Aberforth and Grindelwald, spells flying wild, furniture exploding, and then Ariana appearing from her room where she was supposed to be safe. Ariana drawn by the noise. Ariana caught in the crossfire of a 3-way duel. And then Ariana dead on the floor before anyone could understand what had happened. You sit in silence for a long moment because what can you possibly say to that? What words exist that could address a trauma of that magnitude? And Dumbledore doesn't seem to expect a response anyway. Just continues staring at that photograph of his sister, and you notice his eyes are dry because he's probably cried every tear he had decades ago, probably exhausted his capacity for that particular expression of grief. Grindelwald fled immediately, Dumbledore continues. Fled before they could even determine what happened. Fled back to the continent where he would eventually begin his rise to power, and Albus was left with his dead sister and his devastated brother, and the knowledge that his ambition and selfishness had contributed to this tragedy, had maybe even caused it directly if the spell that killed Ariana was his, which he's never known for certain but suspects in his darkest moments. Aberforth blamed him completely, Dumbledore says, and was right to do so. blamed him for wanting to leave, for bringing Grindelwald into their lives, for caring more about abstract ideological visions than his own sister's safety, and they've barely spoken since, except when absolutely necessary, barely maintained even the pretense of brotherly affection. And you think about how family rifts can last lifetimes, how some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness, even when decades have passed. Much like how the schism between Catholic and Orthodox Christianity has lasted nearly 1,000 years since 1054. When church leaders excommunicated each other over theological disputes and political power struggles that probably seemed terribly important at the time, but which most modern people couldn't explain if their lives depended on it. The quirky historical detail Dumbledore mentions here, almost as an aside, is that Ariana was buried in Godric's Hollow Cemetery on what happened to be the hottest day of 1899, a record-breaking heat wave that killed 16 people across southern England. And he remembers thinking the weather was appropriately hellish for a funeral of someone who died so senselessly, though of course weather doesn't actually care about human tragedy, doesn't arrange itself symbolically, no matter how much we want to see patterns and meaning in random meteorological events. You ask the obvious question, the one that must be asked: does he know which of them cast the spell that killed Ariana? Does he know if it was his curse that ended his sister's life? And Dumbledore meets your eyes for the first time in this entire conversation and says no, he doesn't know. He's replayed that duel in his mind 10,000 times, and he can't be certain whose spell struck her. And maybe that uncertainty is worse than knowing, because it means he can never fully accept responsibility, but also can never be free of it, can never stop wondering if he's a murderer or just someone who enabled murder. The scholarly debate here, he continues in that professorial tone again, is whether not knowing is psychologically protective or psychologically devastating, whether the ambiguity allows him to avoid total self-destruction or condemns him to permanent purgatory, and different psychological frameworks suggest different answers, though he notes wryly that none of them can actually resolve the question for him personally. This event, this terrible afternoon in 1899, became the organizing principle of Dumbledore's entire subsequent life, you realize, became the lens through which he viewed every decision, every opportunity, every temptation toward power, and suddenly so much makes sense. His refusal to take the position of Minister of Magic despite being offered it multiple times, his extreme caution with powerful artifacts, his willingness to operate from behind the scenes rather than seeking glory, his careful attention to protecting students even when it meant making unpopular decisions, his particular sympathy for anyone struggling with dark magic or dark impulses, his understanding that good people can be tempted toward terrible things. You watch him return that photograph to its hiding place, watch him close the false panel, and you understand that this is a ritual he performs regularly, this private moment of remembrance and regret, this self-imposed penance that no one else witnesses, but which shapes everything he does. And you think that maybe this is what redemption looks like. Not some grand gesture of atonement, but the daily choice to remember your worst self and try to be better. Try to make different choices, even when the temptation toward power and glory remains as strong as ever. Here's another joke to cut the tension. You mentioned that his origin story is significantly darker than most people expect, that usually when someone says they learned important lessons in their youth, they mean they tried smoking behind the Quidditch shed or cheated on a charms exam. Not that they accidentally killed their sister while planning wizard world domination with their dark wizard boyfriend. And Dumbledore actually laughs, a short, bitter sound that might be more pain than humor, but at least indicates he's still capable of recognizing absurdity. The lasting impact of Ariana's death appears in small ways throughout Dumbledore's later life, he explains, in his preference for Muggle-style clothing as a subtle rejection of wizard supremacy, in his insistence on hiring controversial teachers like Lupin despite ministry pressure, in his protection of students others considered hopeless or dangerous, in his careful cultivation of multiple sources of information to avoid the blind spots that ideology creates, and most significantly in his absolute refusal to believe that any end, no matter how beneficial it might seem, justifies means that involve treating people as expendable tools rather than individuals deserving of dignity and choice. You notice the moon has risen while he's been talking. Notice that hours have passed in what felt like minutes, and you realize this is probably the longest continuous conversation Dumbledore has had about these events in decades, possibly ever, and you feel oddly privileged to have heard it, even as you feel the weight of knowledge that cannot be shared, secrets that belong only to those directly involved in the tragedy. The question that emerges from this history, Dumbledore continues, is whether someone who has believed terrible things can truly change or whether they're forever marked by their worst impulses. And scholars debate this in contexts ranging from magical history to Muggle philosophy, from religious concepts of redemption to psychological theories of moral development, and some argue that past beliefs inevitably corrupt future actions, while others suggest that recognition and rejection of past errors represents genuine transformation, though of course Dumbledore notes that he might simply be hoping the second group is correct, because the alternative means his entire subsequent life has been performative self-deception. You think about the tremendous arrogance required to believe at 18 that you should rule over millions of people for their own good, and you think about the tremendous humility required to recognize that belief as monstrous, and you wonder which was harder for Dumbledore. The initial intellectual seduction of supremacist ideology or the painful process of dismantling those beliefs and building something better in their place, much like how Germany after World War II faced the difficult process of denazification, of trying to identify and remove Nazi ideology from institutions and individuals. A process that scholars like historian Mary Fulbrook have argued was incomplete and complicated by Cold War politics, with many former Nazis remaining in positions of power because their expertise was deemed necessary for rebuilding. The final quirky detail Dumbledore mentions is that Bathilda Bagshot, Grindelwald's great-aunt, wrote extensively about the history of wizarding families but never mentioned her own family's connection to one of the darkest wizards of the 20th century, never acknowledged that she hosted the meeting between Dumbledore and Grindelwald, never included this personally relevant and historically significant information in any of her celebrated works, and he wonders if she felt guilty about introducing them, or simply believed personal history should remain separate from scholarly history. A debate that continues in academic circles about whether historians can truly maintain objectivity about events they witnessed or participated in. As this section winds toward its close, you understand that Ariana Dumbledore isn't just a tragic figure in her brother's past, but the ghost that haunts every decision he makes, every calculated risk he takes, every time he has to weigh individual suffering against collective benefit. And you see now why he looks so ancient despite magical life extension, why his eyes carry such deep sadness even when he's twinkling at students, why he sometimes seems to be fighting battles no one else can see. Because he is. He's fighting the daily battle against his 18-year-old self, against the person he could have become, against the seductive promise that power wielded by the right people for the right reasons can make everything better. You rise to leave because dawn is approaching and this conversation has to end somewhere, has to have a boundary before it consumes everything, and Dumbledore nods his thanks, seems grateful that you let him speak without judgment, without trying to absolve him or condemn him, just listening as he worked through memories that never stop being painful no matter how many decades pass. And you walk toward the door thinking about how everyone carries secrets that shape them. Everyone has moments they regret that define their subsequent choices, and maybe the measure of a person isn't whether they've done terrible things, but whether they've learned from them. Whether they've let guilt become productive rather than simply destructive, whether they've found ways to honor the dead through the choices they make among the living. You return to Dumbledore's office the following night because the story isn't finished, because understanding the Ariana tragedy is only the beginning. And tonight he's going to tell you about the summer that changed everything. About those weeks in 1899 when he and Grindelwald weren't just friends or intellectual companions, but something more dangerous, something that nearly resulted in a very different 20th century. And as you settle into the same chair, the portraits are already watching with interest, clearly aware that tonight's installment promises to be even more uncomfortable than yesterday's confession. Dumbledore has tea prepared this time, proper English tea with milk and sugar, and you think about how very British it is to discuss the origins of magical fascism over Earl Grey. Much like how the actual Wannsee Conference in 1942, where Nazi officials coordinated the final solution, was apparently very civilized with refreshments served and minutes properly recorded, a bureaucratic horror that historian Mark Roseman describes as a meeting about mass murder where everyone was terribly polite, which tells you something deeply disturbing about humanity's capacity to normalize atrocity. The headmaster looks somehow both more prepared and more exhausted tonight, as if getting through yesterday's revelations took something out of him, but also cleared space for what comes next. And he begins by explaining that you need to understand what Grindelwald was like, to understand why their partnership formed so quickly and burned so bright, why an 18-year-old Dumbledore, who was already brilliant in his own right, found himself intellectually and emotionally overwhelmed by someone equally brilliant but far more ruthless. Grindelwald was beautiful, Dumbledore says with startling directness, beautiful in the way dangerous things often are, with sharp features and sharper intelligence, and eyes that seem to see straight through all your carefully constructed defenses to the ambitions and fears you tried to hide from everyone, including yourself. And you realize this is probably the most honest description of attraction Dumbledore has ever voiced, this acknowledgement that desire isn't always convenient or explicable or directed towards safe, appropriate targets. He was expelled from Durmstrang for experiments involving the dark arts, Dumbledore continues, specifically for attempting to research the Deathly Hallows at an age when most students were worried about their newts. And rather than being chastened by expulsion, he seemed energized by it, seemed to view conventional magical education as a cage that had rightfully rejected him, and this attitude was catnip to young Albus, who had spent his entire Hogwarts career being the perfect student, the one who never broke rules, never questioned authority, always produced exactly what his professors expected, all while secretly resenting every constraint. The Deathly Hallows became their obsession that summer, this quest for 3 legendary objects that supposedly made their possessor master of death. And Dumbledore admits now that he should have recognized this for the dangerous fantasy it was, should have seen that seeking artifacts specifically designed to conquer death demonstrated a fundamental inability to accept human limitation, but instead he found it thrilling. Found the intellectual challenge irresistible, found the transgressive nature of treating children's fairy tales as serious magical history, exactly the kind of paradigm-breaking thinking he'd always craved. You sip your tea and let him talk, noticing how his narrative voice changes when discussing Grindelwald, becomes younger somehow, less controlled, and you think about how first love or first serious infatuation leaves marks that never fully fade. Changes your baseline understanding of emotional intensity, much like how historians note that revolution often appeals most to people who have experienced their first taste of freedom and want more. which explains why the French Revolution of 1789 was driven largely by the rising bourgeoisie who had some rights but wanted complete liberation, rather than by the completely oppressed, who often lacked the resources and vision to imagine radical change. The Deathly Hallows consisted of 3 objects according to Beedle's tale. Dumbledore explains: the Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, and the Cloak of Invisibility. And while most people dismiss this as obvious fiction, Grindelwald had compiled evidence suggesting all 3 were real artifacts scattered across Europe, waiting for someone clever enough to unite them. And here's where scholarly debate gets interesting, because modern historians like Adalbert Waffling have argued that Grindelwald was partially correct, that at least 2 of the 3 hollows demonstrably existed, while other scholars like Bathilda Bagshot suggested the tale was allegory rather than history, a debate that continues even now with new evidence occasionally emerging to support one interpretation or the other. Grindelwald's research traced the Elder Wand through centuries of magical history, Dumbledore says, through a trail of dead wand makers and defeated duelists, through ownership passing violently from hand to hand, and he believed the wand was currently held by Grigorovich, the famous wand maker, which turned out to be accurate, a detail you'll want to remember for later. And more importantly, he believed that whoever possessed all 3 hallows would be invincible, would transcend normal magical limitations, would become essentially a god. And you can hear the shame in Dumbledore's voice as he admits he found this prospect exciting rather than horrifying. Found the idea of transcendence intellectually seductive, even though it required believing in hierarchies of power that justified domination. They spent hours in Bathilda Bagshot's sitting room discussing not just whether the Hallows existed, but what they would do with them once acquired. Dumbledore continues, and this is the part that clearly still causes him pain. These remembered conversations where he enthusiastically participated in planning a future that would have been catastrophic for millions of people, and he describes how they developed what they called a philosophical framework for magical rule over Muggles, how they convinced themselves this wasn't tyranny but enlightened guidance, how they planned to end wizard hiding and establish open magical governance, how they genuinely believed this would benefit everyone involved, because obviously, wizards with their superior abilities should guide the less capable. And you hear in this description the same logic that justified European colonialism, the white man's burden ideology that Rudyard Kipling literally wrote poems about. The idea that domination could be reframed as benevolent paternalism if you just squinted at the power dynamics in the right way. Here's a joke to lighten the increasingly dark mood. You mentioned that every young person thinks they're going to change the world, but most of us mean starting a band or launching a startup, not actually enslaving millions of people. And Dumbledore gives you a look that's half amused and half despairing, says that the difference between youthful ambition and genuinely dangerous ideology is often just access to resources and enablers, and Grindelwald was an excellent enabler for all his worst impulses. The summer days in Godric's Hollow that year were unusually beautiful, Dumbledore remembers. Long golden afternoons that stretched into purple evenings, and he and Grindelwald would walk through the village and surrounding countryside discussing their plans, oblivious to how their intense private conversations must have appeared to neighbors, oblivious to everything except their shared vision. And you realize this is a very specific kind of intoxication, this sense that you and one other person can see truths invisible to everyone else, can recognize possibilities others are too limited or conventional to imagine, and it creates a bubble of mutual reinforcement where increasingly extreme ideas start seeming not just reasonable but obvious. They developed specific plans for magical rule, Dumbledore admits, actually drafted what amounted to a constitution for their new world order, decided who would hold what responsibilities, debated whether to maintain the appearance of Muggle government while actually controlling it from behind the scenes, or whether to establish openly magical rule, discussed how to handle resistance, how to educate the next generation to accept magical governance as natural, and you feel slightly sick. listening to this, because these weren't idle fantasies, but actual operational planning, the groundwork for what Grindelwald would later implement on a smaller scale during his rise to power in the 1930s and 40s. The scholarly debate about this period centers on several key questions that Dumbledore outlines almost clinically now, his professor voice fully engaged as a defense mechanism against emotional vulnerability, and he explains how historians argue about whether young Dumbledore was genuinely committed to wizard supremacy, or whether he was primarily motivated by personal factors like his attraction to Grindelwald and his desperate desire to escape Godric's Hollow, about whether their ideology was originally more benevolent than it became, or whether the supremacist elements were always central, about whether intellectual collaboration between them was equal, or whether Grindelwald dominated their theorizing, and about what exact role romantic or sexual attraction played in their partnership. You notice he's still avoiding directly answering some of these questions, even as he presents them as scholarly debates, and you're starting to recognize this as his signature move, this way of discussing personal history as if it's distant academic material. But then he surprises you again by saying that yes, he was attracted to Grindelwald in every possible sense, intellectually and emotionally, and physically. And no, that attraction doesn't excuse his participation in developing supremacist ideology, but it does explain some of the intensity and irrationality of his commitment. And you appreciate this moment of complete honesty even as you recognize how much it must cost him to voice it. The symbol of the Deathly Hallows became their private sign that summer, Dumbledore continues. This triangular mark representing the cloak, the stone, and the wand, and they drew it everywhere, carved it into wood, sketched it on parchment, and Grindelwald later adopted it as his personal symbol during his rise to power, using it to mark buildings and rally supporters. And Dumbledore notes that seeing that symbol spray-painted on walls during Grindelwald's reign was like seeing his own youthful arrogance weaponized, like watching a private language of romance transformed into a public language of terror, much like how the swastika was an ancient symbol in various cultures before the Nazis appropriated it and made it synonymous with genocide, forever changing its meaning in global consciousness. Quirky historical detail. Godric's Hollow in 1899 had a population of approximately 300 people, half magical and half muggle, and it hosted one of the few intentionally integrated communities in Britain at that time, a social experiment that began in the 1850s and succeeded primarily because both populations agreed to ignore each other's existence. A peculiar solution that Dumbledore notes highlights how difficult genuine integration is when one group possesses vast power advantages over the other. A dynamic that makes the supremacist conclusion nearly inevitable unless actively resisted. Their plans required the Deathly Hallows as both practical tools and symbolic legitimization, Dumbledore explains, required artifacts that would prove they deserved power because they were capable of obtaining and wielding objects of legendary power, and this reasoning demonstrates the circular logic of supremacist thinking. We deserve power because we can take power, and we can take power because we deserve it, and anyone who resists is simply unable to recognize the natural order of things. And you think about how many atrocities have been justified through exactly this kind of reasoning, from the Atlantic slave trade to the Holocaust to every colonial venture that claimed to bring civilization to the barbarous. All of them fundamentally assuming that might makes right and that superior force indicates superior worth. The practical question they debated endlessly was how to locate the Hallows, Dumbledore continues, how to track down objects that had disappeared from reliable historical record. And Grindelwald believed the Elder Wand was findable through investigation of recent dueling history, believed the Resurrection Stone might be hidden in the Gaunt family's artifacts based on certain genealogical connections to the Peverils, who originally possessed the Hallows, and believed the Cloak of Invisibility was likely lost forever, unless it surfaced unexpectedly, which actually turned out to be incorrect on that last point, because the cloak was sitting in a vault in Godric's Hollow the entire time, owned by the Potter family. But neither of them knew this, which Dumbledore notes is perhaps the most ironic detail of the entire summer because the object they sought was literally a few streets away while they were planning expeditions across Europe. You ask what they actually planned to do once they had the Hallows, what the next concrete step would have been, and Dumbledore's face darkens as he admits they planned to first demonstrate their power through some dramatic public action, something that would force the wizarding world to acknowledge their capabilities, something that would make their manifesto impossible to ignore, and they debated options ranging from ending the statute of secrecy unilaterally, to defeating some famous dark wizard, to performing some feat of magic previously thought impossible. And you realize these were the fantasies of 18-year-olds who had convinced themselves they were destined for significance, who couldn't imagine a future where they weren't reshaping the world. And you think about how many young intellectuals throughout history have believed similar things, have convinced themselves that conventional morality doesn't apply to them because they can see further than ordinary people, can recognize necessities others are too sentimental to accept. A pattern you see in everyone, from the Jacobins of the French Revolution who sent thousands to the guillotine in the name of liberty, to the Bolsheviks who justified authoritarian control as necessary for achieving eventual communist utopia. Here's another joke, because this is getting oppressively dark. You note that their gap year plans were significantly more ambitious than most, that usually post-graduation trips involve backpacking through Thailand and finding yourself, not finding legendary artifacts of death and using them to subjugate humanity. And Dumbledore smiles slightly, says that ambition has always been his besetting sin, that moderation has never been his strength, and you appreciate that he can still mock himself even when discussing his worst failures. Aberforth was suspicious of Grindelwald from the start. Dumbledore admits his younger brother recognized something wrong in the intensity of Albus's new friendship, recognized that Grindelwald encouraged all of Albus's worst impulses while showing no real interest in their family situation, showed no sympathy for Ariana's condition, seemed to view her as simply an inconvenient obstacle to Albus's proper destiny, and these observations were completely accurate, but Albus dismissed them as jealousy, dismissed Aberforth's concerns as the complaints of someone too provincial and small-minded to understand greatness, and you can hear the regret in his voice as he describes how thoroughly he prioritized Grindelwald's approval over his brother's legitimate worries. The deeper issue that Aberforth identified but Albus ignored was that Grindelwald had a casual cruelty beneath his intellectual charm. Dumbledore continues, a willingness to hurt people without particular malice, but also without particular concern, a tendency to view other people as tools or obstacles rather than as beings deserving consideration in their own right. And this was visible in small ways that summer in how he spoke about Muggles, in how he dismissed Arian as humanity, in how he treated Bathilda's house elf, in dozens of tiny moments that should have been warning signs but that Albus rationalized away because acknowledging them would have required questioning whether someone he loved was actually a good person. And you think about how often people ignore red flags in relationships because we become invested in our narrative about who someone is, rather than observing who they actually are. A psychological tendency that experts like Gavin de Becker discuss in The Gift of Fear, this preference for comforting stories over uncomfortable realities. The question scholars still debate is whether Dumbledore actually believed the ideology he and Grindelwald developed, or whether he was primarily motivated by desire to be with Grindelwald and would have convinced himself to believe anything that enabled that. And Dumbledore says honestly that he doesn't know, that memory is unreliable about such things, that he wants to believe he was simply young and stupid rather than genuinely committed to wizard supremacy, but he can't be certain, can't separate the intellectual seduction from the personal seduction, can't know if he would have developed these beliefs without Grindelwald's influence, or if Grindelwald simply gave voice to ideas Albus already held but hadn't acknowledged. And this uncertainty haunts him more than confident knowledge of his worst self would, because it means he can never be sure exactly what he's guarding against in himself. can never know precisely which temptations are most dangerous. The summer was racing toward its conclusion, Dumbledore continues. Grindelwald's stay with Bathilda was temporary, and he would need to leave soon, and they were making final plans for departing together, for beginning their quest, for abandoning Godric's Hollow and everything that tied Albus down. And in retrospect, the speed with which these plans developed should have been a warning sign, should have indicated that they weren't thinking clearly, weren't considering consequences, weren't accounting for complications, but instead the rush felt romantic, felt like finally taking action after years of frustrated waiting, felt like the beginning of everything they dreamed about during those long, golden afternoons of conversation and planning. You can see the pain in Dumbledore's face as he approaches the part of the story you already know the ending to, the part where everything collapses and you stay silent because this clearly needs to be told at his own pace, in his own way, without interruption. And he describes the morning Aberforth came home early from Hogwarts, having learned of their plans somehow, having realized that Albus intended to abandon Ariana completely, and the fight that erupted was years in the making. Wasn't really about just that summer, but about their entire childhood, about their father's imprisonment, about their mother's death, about Albus's obvious resentment of his family responsibilities, about Aberforth's perception that Albus viewed their damaged sister as an embarrassment rather than a person deserving of care and dignity. Grindelwald's response to this family confrontation was to mock Aberforth, Dumbledore admits with shame, to explicitly argue that Ariana was essentially already dead, that her life had no value given her inability to control her magic or participate in normal society, and that caring for her was a waste of time and resources better spent on people who could actually contribute something meaningful to the world. And hearing this eugenic logic stated so baldly should have shattered Albus's illusions about Grindelwald's character, should have made him recognize the monster beneath the brilliant exterior, but instead he tried to defend both of them simultaneously, tried to calm Aberforth while signaling to Grindelwald that he didn't really believe that extreme position, and you recognize this as the moral cowardice it was. This attempt to maintain comfort with both sides rather than taking a clear stand. The duel that followed was chaotic, Dumbledore says. 3 people in close quarters, all casting simultaneously, spells bouncing off walls and furniture, the small cottage space making it impossible to maintain safe distance or clear lines of fire. And he remembers the smell of scorched wood and the sound of breaking glass and Aberforth's rage and Grindelwald's cold focus and his own panic at losing control of the situation, at watching his carefully constructed summer fantasy collapse into violence. And then, the moment that ended everything, the moment Ariana appeared in her nightgown at the top of the stairs, drawn by the noise, frightened and confused, and someone's spell, maybe all of their spells. He can't remember the exact sequence. He's never been able to remember clearly despite replaying it thousands of times, struck her, and she fell, and by the time they reached her, she was already dead. The silence that followed lasted forever, Dumbledore remembers, lasted years compressed into seconds, and he looked at his sister's body and at Aberforth's face, which had transformed from rage to devastation, and at Grindelwald, who looked calculating rather than horrified, who was already stepping backward toward the door, already preparing to flee, and Albus felt something break inside himself, felt the summer's fantasy shatter completely, felt the sudden recognition that he'd been playing at philosophy with someone who had no actual moral center, who viewed other people as expendable, who would abandon even his closest companion the moment circumstances became inconvenient. And you realize this was the moment Dumbledore truly saw Grindelwald for what he was. Not when Ariana died, but in the seconds immediately after, when Grindelwald's first instinct was self-preservation rather than grief or accountability. Grindelwald left, Dumbledore continues, simply walked out of the cottage and disappeared, left the country, would not be seen again until years later when he began his rise to power in Central Europe, and Albus was left with his dead sister and his devastated brother, and no clear understanding of what had just happened, whose fault it was, whether he was a murderer or just someone whose bad judgment enabled murder, and he describes standing there in the destroyed cottage trying to understand how his summer of intellectual excitement and romantic possibility had ended with his sister dead on the floor and his future transformed from limitless potential to endless penance. Aberforth's accusation was simple and devastating. Dumbledore says, "You killed her!" And regardless of whose spell actually struck Ariana, the statement was true in every way that mattered, because Albus's choices had created the circumstances that led to her death. His prioritization of Grindelwald over family, his willingness to abandon Ariana to pursue grand ambitions, his participation in planning a supremacist future that required viewing some lives as less valuable than others, all of it culminated in this moment, this preventable tragedy, this death that was nobody's explicit goal, but everyone's collective responsibility, though mostly his, Dumbledore admits, mostly his because he was older, because he should have known better, because he was the one who let Grindelwald into their lives despite warning signs, because he valued intellectual excitement and romantic attention over his sister's safety and his family's well-being. The funeral was horrible, Dumbledore remembers. Horrible in the way that funerals for young people always are, but worse because of the circumstances. Because everyone in Godric's Hollow knew or suspected that Ariana died during a magical fight. Because the whispers and speculation were inescapable. Because Aberforth stood on the opposite side of the grave and wouldn't look at him, wouldn't acknowledge his existence except to radiate blame and rage, and Dumbledore says he deserved every bit of Aberforth's hatred. Deserved to be seen as the brother who prioritized ambition over family, who let his sister die while he was planning to conquer the world for her own good, which really might be the most monstrous irony of the entire tragedy. Here's a quirky historical detail that Dumbledore mentions with grim humor. Ariana's funeral took place on the same day that Arthur Conan Doyle published The Hound of the Baskervilles, returning Sherlock Holmes to public life after his apparent death at Reichenbach Falls. And Dumbledore remembers seeing the newspaper announcement and thinking how nice it must be to live in stories where detective heroes actually came back from death, and everything worked out satisfactorily in the end. Unlike real life, where the dead stayed dead and consequences lasted forever. And you think about how we often seek comfort in fiction exactly because it provides the neat resolutions and moral clarity that reality refuses to offer. The immediate aftermath involved ministry investigations, Dumbledore continues, because 3 wizards dueling and 1 ending up dead triggers official scrutiny. But the inquiry concluded that Ariana's death was accidental, that no one could determine whose spell killed her, that it was a tragedy, but not a prosecutable crime. And the case was closed with no charges filed, which technically was probably the correct legal outcome, but which felt to Dumbledore like he'd escaped justice through technical insufficiency of evidence, like he'd gotten away with something that deserved punishment. And this sense of unpunished guilt has followed him ever since, has made him almost eager to accept responsibility and consequences for his later actions because it feels like he's still serving the sentence he should have received in 1899. The question that emerges is whether Dumbledore would have eventually recognized the problems with supremacist ideology without Ariana's death, or whether only that traumatic shock was sufficient to break through his intellectual arrogance and force him to confront what he'd been planning. And Dumbledore admits he doesn't know, suspects he might have continued down that path if circumstances hadn't intervened so dramatically, might have become a collaborator in Grindelwald's later atrocities, or possibly even a co-leader of them. And this recognition that he was perhaps only an accident away from becoming history's villain rather than hero has shaped his entire understanding of morality as contingent and fragile, as something that requires constant vigilance precisely because good intentions guarantee nothing, Because intelligence creates as many opportunities for evil as for good. Because the distance between helping and harming is often just a matter of whether you're willing to acknowledge harm when you're causing it. The scholarly debate here involves competing theories of moral development. Dumbledore notes some scholars arguing that people have essentially fixed ethical characters that circumstances reveal rather than create, while others suggest that morality is highly contextual, and that small historical variations could produce radically different outcomes for individuals. And he clearly finds the second position more plausible based on personal experience, but also more terrifying because it means no one is safe from becoming their worst self. That vigilance can never relax, that past good behavior predicts nothing about future choices, much like how many Nazi concentration camp commandants were reportedly loving fathers and cultured individuals who appreciated classical music, suggesting that evil doesn't require obviously evil people, but only normal people in situations where evil becomes systematized and normalized, a point that Hannah Arendt famously argued regarding Adolf Eichmann's trial in her concept of the banality of evil. You watch dawn approach again through the office windows, watch the sky lighten, and Dumbledore looks exhausted but also somehow unburdened, as if telling this story has served some psychological purpose, even though it changes nothing material about what happened. And you think about how confession might be valuable even without absolution, how speaking truth might matter even when it cannot undo consequences. How memory shared becomes different from memory hoarded alone in the darkness of private guilt. The connection between this summer and Grindelwald's later atrocities is direct, Dumbledore says as the conversation winds down, because Grindelwald implemented their shared plans, built the supremacist movement they had outlined together, used the symbol they had drawn on lazy afternoons as his mark of power, and when Dumbledore finally faced him in 1945, it wasn't just defeating a dark wizard, but defeating his own 18-year-old self, destroying the ideology he had helped create, and winning that duel felt less like triumph than like self-amputation, necessary but agonizing, removing something that had been part of himself even though it had turned poisonous. The final insight Dumbledore offers as you prepare to leave is that he's spent his entire subsequent life trying to help students avoid his mistakes, trying to create conditions where young people's worst impulses don't get reinforced and enabled the way Grindelwald reinforced his, trying to catch warning signs early, trying to model a different approach to power and knowledge. But he's never confident it's sufficient because he knows from personal experience how easily intelligence can be corrupted, how attractive supremacist thinking can be when wrapped in philosophical sophistication, how love or desire or ambition can override judgment. And so he watches constantly, intervenes carefully, offers second chances, because he knows he would have benefited from someone intervening in his own trajectory before Ariana died, before his choices became irreversible tragedies rather than recoverable mistakes. You settle into what has become your regular chair in Dumbledore's office for a third consecutive night, and this time he has a wand laid out on his desk, not his current wand, but another one, longer and darker, and you recognize it immediately, even though you've only seen it in books, because there's only one wand that would hold significance for this particular conversation, and Dumbledore confirms your suspicion with a weary nod, as he says, yes, this is the Elder Wand, the most powerful wand ever created according to legend, the most dangerous magical artifact he's ever possessed, and the source of his most carefully guarded shame. Though you're starting to think that Dumbledore has enough carefully guarded shame to fill a Gringotts vault, which you mention, and he actually laughs, says that's probably accurate, that accumulating regrets has been his most consistent talent throughout a long and supposedly distinguished life. The Elder Wand's history is written in blood, Dumbledore begins, every transfer of its allegiance marked by violence because the wand passes to whoever defeats its previous master, creating an incentive structure that guarantees centuries of murder and betrayal. And he traces this history backward from himself to Grindelwald, to Grigorovich, to a chain of dark wizards and ambitious duelists stretching back to the 13th century, or possibly earlier depending on which historical account you trust. And you think about how creating an artifact specifically designed to be won through violence is possibly the worst idea in magical history. Like designing a crown that gives its wearer absolute power, but only if they murder the previous wearer, which would predictably create an endless cycle of assassination and paranoia. The scholarly debate about the Elder Wand's origins involves whether it was actually created by death, as Beetle's tale suggests, or whether it was crafted by the eldest Peveril brother, Antioch, who was simply an extraordinarily skilled wand maker. And Dumbledore notes that most serious historians favor the second explanation because death doesn't typically hand out party favors. But he also admits the wand demonstrates properties that are difficult to explain through normal wand lore, suggesting either that the Peverils possessed knowledge now lost, or that the wand's reputation has accumulated a kind of magical momentum over centuries, with countless witches and wizards believing so strongly in its power that belief itself became a kind of enchantment layered over whatever the wand originally was, much like how medieval relics of saints were often fake bones and splinters, but accumulated such devotional energy that they arguably became sacred through belief itself, a phenomenon that religious studies scholars like Caroline Walker Bynum have documented extensively in examining the material culture of medieval Christianity. You ask how Dumbledore came to possess the Elder Wand, and his answer is the center of tonight's story, the pivotal moment that defines his entire relationship with power and temptation. And he explains that he sought out Grindelwald in 1945 not primarily to stop his atrocities, though that was certainly necessary and urgent, but because he knew Grindelwald possessed the Elder Wand, and Dumbledore wanted it, needed it actually, needed to possess this artifact that he and Grindelwald had fantasized about during that terrible summer in 1899, needed to complete what they'd started, needed to finally hold the power they'd dreamed of. And you realize with a shock that Dumbledore is admitting the duel everyone celebrates as his greatest heroic moment was at least partially motivated by desire for a dark artifact, by ambition and fascination, and the same impulses that led him toward supremacist ideology as a teenager. The context in 1945 was that Grindelwald had been waging his war for magical supremacy for nearly 15 years. Dumbledore continues, had conquered most of Central Europe, had built Nurmengard Prison to hold his opponents, had orchestrated atrocities that killed thousands. And the international wizarding community was begging Dumbledore to intervene because he was the only wizard powerful enough to potentially defeat Grindelwald. But Dumbledore had been refusing, had been finding excuses, had been delaying year after year. And you ask why? Ask what possible reason could justify allowing such destruction to continue. And Dumbledore's answer is devastatingly honest. He was afraid that if he faced Grindelwald, he would learn definitively whose spell had killed Ariana. Here's a joke to cut through the heaviness of that revelation. You mentioned that most people avoid their exes at parties or by taking different routes to work. They don't usually let them conquer entire continents just to avoid awkward conversations. And Dumbledore gives you a look that's part amusement and part despair. Says that he's always excelled at taking character flaws to their logical extremes, that moderation has never been his strength as previously established, and you can see how this admission costs him. This acknowledgement that his personal psychological avoidance contributed to years of unnecessary suffering for thousands of people who had no idea their supposed protector was paralyzed by private guilt. The pressure to confront Grindelwald became overwhelming by late 1945, Dumbledore explains, with ministry representatives visiting Hogwarts weekly, with letters from victims and resistance fighters arriving daily, with his colleagues and friends asking increasingly pointed questions about why the great Albus Dumbledore wouldn't act, and finally he accepted that his avoidance was itself a form of cowardice, worse than anything he feared learning about that duel in 1899. that he owed it to Grindelwald's victims to overcome his personal demons. And so he traveled to the castle Normangard where Grindelwald had established his headquarters, carrying his own wand and his terror and his unresolved feelings about someone he'd loved and hated in equal measure for nearly 5 decades. And you think about what it means to face someone who represents both your worst self and your greatest temptation, who knows your secrets and shares your shame, who could destroy you with a word even before raising a wand, much like how Cold War espionage often involved former friends or lovers who had been on the same side before ideology split them, like Kim Philby betraying his MI6 colleagues to serve Soviet intelligence. Relationships poisoned by political commitment but retaining emotional memory of what they'd been before the betrayal. The duel itself lasted hours according to eyewitness accounts, Dumbledore says, though few people were actually present because both duelists were consciously performing for each other rather than an audience. Were fighting not just with spells, but with the accumulated weight of their shared history, and Dumbledore describes it as the most painful experience of his life, not because of physical danger, though there was plenty of that, but because every spell they cast was also an argument, every defensive move a rebuttal, every attack an accusation, and they were fighting about that summer in 1899 as much as about Grindelwald's current atrocities, fighting about who had corrupted whom, who bore more responsibility for Ariana's death, who had betrayed their shared ideals versus who had remained true to them. Grindelwald was brilliant, Dumbledore admits, with something that still sounds like admiration even now, brilliant and terrible, and still somehow beautiful in his conviction, still absolutely certain that wizard rule was correct and necessary, that the deaths he'd caused were acceptable costs for the greater good they would eventually achieve. And hearing their old phrase turned into justification for genocide should have been purely horrifying. But Dumbledore confesses it was also seductive, that for moments during their duel he felt the pull of that old certainty, that old shared vision, felt the temptation to join rather than defeat, to pick up where they'd left off, to implement their plans together as they'd originally intended. And only the memory of Ariana's body on that cottage floor kept him focused on stopping rather than joining Grindelwald's crusade. The Elder Wand became visible in Grindelwald's hand during the duel, Dumbledore continues, and he recognized it immediately, even though he'd never actually seen it before. Recognized it from years of research and obsession, from hundreds of hours spent discussing it with Grindelwald during that summer of 1899, from dreams and nightmares that featured it prominently, and seeing it in Grindelwald's possession created a fierce desire that had nothing to do with stopping atrocities and everything to do with wanting what had been denied to him all those years ago. Wanting to possess the ultimate symbol of magical power, wanting to hold the artifact that represented both his greatest ambition and his greatest shame. You ask if possessing the Elder Wand made Grindelwald more powerful, and Dumbledore explains that's a complicated question, because the wand definitely enhanced his abilities, but more importantly, it enhanced his confidence and his followers' belief in him, created an aura of invincibility that was partially self-fulfilling, that made people hesitant to challenge him because they believed the wand made him unbeatable. And this psychological advantage was arguably more valuable than any technical magical enhancement, which tells you something about how power functions, how perception often matters more than reality, how symbols can shape outcomes as effectively as actual capabilities, much like how the atomic bomb's value to the United States during the Cold War wasn't primarily its potential use, but rather the diplomatic leverage it provided, the way its existence shaped negotiations and relationships, a phenomenon that international relations scholar Robert Jervis analyzed extensively in examining how perceived capabilities influence state behavior. The moment Dumbledore defeated Grindelwald is one he's replayed endlessly in memory, he says, because it involved a complex spell sequence that left both of them vulnerable and required Dumbledore to trust his instincts over calculation, to act before fully understanding what he was doing. And the spell that finally overcame Grindelwald's defenses was one Dumbledore had invented years earlier, a piece of magic that combined transfiguration and charms in ways that shouldn't work according to standard theory, but did work because Dumbledore had never been particularly concerned with standard theory. And when Grindelwald fell, Dumbledore felt simultaneously triumphant and devastated, relieved and bereft, because he'd won, but he'd also definitively ended whatever remained of their connection, had destroyed the last possibility that they might somehow reconcile or find understanding or at least achieve closure. Grindelwald's final words before Dumbledore imprisoned him were about Ariana, Dumbledore says quietly. Words that still haunt him because Grindelwald claimed to know whose spell killed her, claimed he'd always known, and then refused to say. Just smiled that terrible knowing smile and said that uncertainty was a more appropriate punishment than knowledge would be, and Dumbledore has spent decades wondering if this was truth or just Grindelwald's final cruelty, a way to ensure his victim could never find peace, could never know for certain, would spend the rest of his life wondering and guessing and doubting. And here, by the way, while we're pausing at this crucial moment in magical history, I'm really curious. From which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. The global reach of these tales about power and corruption and the difficulty of redemption seems worth acknowledging, seems relevant to the universal themes Dumbledore's life illustrates, and you imagine people in dozens of countries hearing this story and perhaps seeing something of their own struggles with temptation and failure, and the daily effort required to be better than your worst impulses. The Elder Wand passed to Dumbledore in that moment, he continues, its allegiance transferring because he'd defeated its previous master, and picking it up afterward was one of the most dangerous moments of his life because he felt everything he'd feared he would feel, the rush of power, the sense of capability beyond normal limits, the seductive whisper that with this wand he could accomplish anything, fix anything, enforce any outcome he deemed best, and for several minutes he stood in Nurmengard, holding the Elder Wand, and seriously contemplated keeping Grindelwald's war going, but under his own supposedly more ethical leadership, contemplated using this power to actually implement benevolent magical rule, contemplated becoming exactly what he'd fought against, but justifying it as different because his intentions were pure and his intelligence sufficient to avoid Grindelwald's mistakes. What stopped him, Dumbledore admits, wasn't moral certainty, but simple exhaustion and the recognition that he'd had these exact thoughts before at age 18, and they'd led to his sister's death. And if he couldn't trust his judgment, then he probably couldn't trust it now. And so he made the decision that has defined his subsequent life. He kept the Elder Wand but resolved never to use it except in the most extreme circumstances, kept it as a reminder of his capacity for corruption, kept it close because keeping it close meant he could control it and prevent it falling into worse hands, but refused to actually wield the power it offered because he knew himself too well, knew he couldn't be trusted with ultimate power, knew his own ambition and arrogance would eventually corrupt any good intentions he started with. The quirky historical detail here is that the duel between Dumbledore and Grindelwald took place on April 30th, 1945, the same day Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker, and Dumbledore notes this wasn't coincidence, but rather that Grindelwald had been watching Muggle affairs with interest, had seen in Nazi Germany a kind of parallel movement to his own, and chose that particular day to make his final stand because he wanted to time his defeat symbolically with the fall of the regime he'd been observing and in some ways admiring, which is deeply disturbing but also tells you something about how Grindelwald understood his own project, understood it explicitly as wizard equivalent of fascism, understood the comparison and embraced it rather than being offended by it. You ask what Dumbledore did with the Elder Wand after defeating Grindelwald, and he explains that he faced a series of choices that each involved moral hazard, that he could have destroyed it, but feared that might simply free its power to find a new physical form, that he could have hidden it, but then others might seek it, and the search itself would cause suffering, that he could have given it to the ministry, but trusted them even less than he trusted himself, and so he kept it, used his regular wand for daily life, but kept the Elder Wand close, and eventually buried it with him. Or at least, that had been his plan before circumstances became more complicated. But we'll get to that in the final section, because first, you need to understand what possessing the Elder Wand for decades taught him about power and temptation and the daily struggle required to resist using a tool you know could solve problems, but would corrupt you in the solving. The Elder Wand whispers, Dumbledore says, not literally but psychologically, constantly suggesting uses, constantly reminding him of its presence, constantly offering solutions that involve overwhelming power, and living with this temptation has been like living with an addiction you've resolved not to feed, like having alcohol in the house when you're an alcoholic or money in your pocket when you're a compulsive gambler, like constant exposure to the thing that could destroy you if you gave in for even a moment, and he admits there have been times over the decades when he's come close to using it, times when a crisis seemed to justify extraordinary measures, times when his conviction wavered and the wand's promises seemed worth the risk. The scholarly debate about whether Dumbledore should have destroyed the Elder Wand immediately after defeating Grindelwald continues among magical historians, he notes, with some arguing that keeping it demonstrated exactly the kind of arrogance that led to his earlier mistakes, that believing he alone could be trusted with ultimate power was itself a form of supremacist thinking, while others suggest that his restraint in not using it, despite possessing it for decades, demonstrates genuine moral growth, that holding power without wielding it requires more strength than simply avoiding power altogether, and Dumbledore himself seems genuinely uncertain which position is correct, seems to think perhaps both critiques are valid, simultaneously, that he was both wise and foolish to keep the wand, both showing admirable restraint and problematic arrogance. Here's another joke to lighten the mood. You mentioned that most people's biggest temptation is eating too much dessert or staying up past bedtime. They're not usually resisting the urge to use ultimate magical power to reshape civilization, and Dumbledore says that he'd trade places gladly, that he'd much prefer struggling with chocolate consumption to struggling with the daily choice not to become a dictator, and you appreciate that he can still find humor in his own dramatic problems even while taking them seriously. The connection between the Elder Wand and his later decisions becomes clear as Dumbledore explains that possessing it made him hyper-aware of his own capacity for rationalization, his talent for convincing himself that questionable actions served good purposes. And this awareness shaped how he dealt with threats to the wizarding world, shaped his tendency to operate through proxies and manipulation rather than direct action, shaped his absolute refusal to take positions of official authority like Minister of Magic, because he knew that combining the Elder Wand's power with political power would be catastrophic, that he couldn't trust himself with that combination, that his 18-year-old self, who had planned wizard supremacy, was still somewhere inside him waiting for an opportunity to emerge. The question that haunts him most, Dumbledore continues, is whether keeping the Elder Wand made him safer or more dangerous, whether having it prevented worse people from obtaining it, or whether his very possession of it drew dangerous attention and created situations that wouldn't have existed if he'd simply destroyed it decades ago. And this uncertainty mirrors his broader uncertainty about his own nature, about whether he's fundamentally changed since 1899 or is simply the same person under better control, whether his restraint represents genuine transformation or just successful management of persistent, dark impulses. And you think about how these questions matter beyond just Dumbledore's personal psychology, how they speak to broader questions about redemption and moral development, and whether people can truly change or just learn to better suppress their worst selves. The Elder Wand's presence in his life also affected his teaching, Dumbledore explains, made him particularly attentive to students who showed signs of excessive ambition or interest in powerful artifacts, or willingness to justify questionable means with appeals to good ends, because he saw his younger self in these students, saw warning signs he wished someone had recognized and addressed in him before Ariana died, and you realize that much of his seemingly eccentric approach to education was actually carefully calibrated to interrupt trajectories that might lead to his own mistakes, to provide alternatives to paths he himself had walked, to model different responses to ambition and power, and the seductive promise of making the world better through force. The relationship between power and corruption is something Dumbledore has spent decades contemplating, he says, and his conclusion is that power doesn't corrupt so much as it removes constraints that hide existing corruption, that having power reveals what you were willing to do all along but previously couldn't. And this means the solution isn't avoiding power entirely, which is impossible if you want to accomplish anything significant, but rather cultivating the psychological structures that maintain ethical behavior even when external constraints disappear, cultivating the internal voice that says no when no one else can make you stop, cultivating the practice of justifying decisions to yourself rather than just to others. Because self-deception is the most dangerous deception, much like how psychologist Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment demonstrated that ordinary college students would abuse power over prisoners once given authority and anonymity, suggesting that ethical behavior requires more than good intentions, but rather consistent practice and external accountability structures. You watch Dumbledore handle the Elder Wand, watch him touch it gently, and then pull his hand away as if it burns. And you understand this is a ritual he performs regularly, this testing of his own resistance to temptation, this checking whether today might be the day he finally gives in and uses the power he's been hoarding for decades. And the fact that he maintains this vigilance, even after all these years, tells you something about how seriously he takes the threat he poses to himself. How he understands that moral victories aren't permanent, that resisting temptation once doesn't mean you can relax your guard. That virtue requires constant renewal like a subscription service that cancels automatically if you miss a payment. The story of how the Elder Wand arrived in Grindelwald's possession is itself interesting, Dumbledore continues, because Grindelwald stole it from the wand maker Grigorovich in the 1920s, broke into his workshop and stunned him, taking the wand without ever revealing his identity, and Grigorovich spent the rest of his life trying to replicate the Elder Wand's properties in his own creations, trying to rebuild what was stolen from him. And Dumbledore notes that this obsessive pursuit of something lost is itself a cautionary tale about how artifacts like the Elder Wand damage everyone they touch, not just through direct violence, but through the dreams and desires they inspire, the way they twist normal ambition into compulsion, normal curiosity into dangerous obsession. The question of why Dumbledore never visited Grindelwald in prison after their duel is another point of scholarly interest, Dumbledore explains, with various historians suggesting explanations ranging from simple avoidance to fear that visiting would reignite old feelings to concern that Grindelwald might still have psychological power over him. And Dumbledore admits that all of these factors played a role, but mostly he stayed away because he knew that seeing Grindelwald would make him question decisions he'd made, would introduce doubt into the careful structures he'd built to maintain his own stability, would risk awakening the person he'd been during that summer in 1899, and he couldn't afford that risk, couldn't afford any weakness in his self-control because the consequences of failure were too catastrophic. As this section approaches its end, you realize the Elder Wand represents not just power, but the burden of knowledge about yourself, the weight of understanding exactly what you're capable of in your worst moments. And Dumbledore has carried this burden for decades, has lived with the constant reminder of his own potential for corruption, has maintained vigilance against himself as much as against external threats. and you think about how exhausting this must be, how tiring it must be to never trust yourself, to always second-guess your motivations, to analyze every decision for hidden selfishness or rationalized cruelty. And you wonder if maybe this level of self-doubt is the price of having once believed yourself capable of ruling the world. If maybe the penance for supreme arrogance is supreme uncertainty. If maybe Dumbledore's tragedy is that he can never simply act with confidence because he knows too well how confidence can mask terrible choices. You arrive at Dumbledore's office for what you sense will be the final night of these confessions, and this time there are two photographs on his desk, one of Ariana that you've seen before, and one of a dark-haired boy with green eyes who you recognize immediately, even though you've never seen him as a child, and Dumbledore sees your recognition and nods slowly as he says, "Yes, tonight you're going to learn about Harry Potter, about the choices Dumbledore made regarding the boy who lived, about the careful cultivation of a weapon disguised as a student, about the calculations that would horrify anyone who still believed Dumbledore was purely good, and you settle in for what you know will be the most disturbing installment of these nightly revelations, because manipulating children for the greater good is perhaps the most unforgivable of Dumbledore's sins, except that he's about to explain why he believes it was absolutely necessary. The story begins before Harry was born. Dumbledore explains. Begins with a prophecy that Sybil Trelawney delivered in 1980 during her job interview for the divination position at Hogwarts, a prophecy about a child born at the end of July who would have power to defeat the Dark Lord. And Dumbledore heard this prophecy and immediately began planning how to use it, how to shape events around it, how to transform whatever child fulfilled these conditions into the weapon that would be needed to stop Voldemort. And you feel slightly sick already because he's talking about an infant as a weapon, as a tool to be shaped rather than a person to be protected. The prophecy created what Dumbledore calls a self-fulfilling tactical situation, he continues, because once Voldemort learned of it, he would inevitably target the child it referenced, and Voldemort's targeting would itself fulfill the prophecy's conditions, would mark the child as his equal, would set in motion the exact circumstances the prophecy predicted, and Dumbledore recognized this immediately, saw that he didn't just need to protect potential targets, but needed to ensure the prophecy fulfilled itself in ways that served his strategic goals, which meant making choices about which child would become Voldemort's focus, which family would be sacrificed, which infant would be transformed into a weapon. And you realize he's admitting to something almost unthinkable, admitting that he helped arrange the circumstances that led to James and Lily Potter's deaths. Here's a joke, though it's almost too dark to qualify as humor. You mentioned that most mentors help their protégés develop their potential. They don't usually arrange their parents' murders as part of a long-term strategic plan, and Dumbledore doesn't laugh, just gives you a look of such profound weariness that you regret the attempt at levity. But then he says that yes, traditional mentorship is generally less homicidal, and you appreciate that he's still trying to maintain some equilibrium even while discussing his most monstrous choices. The scholarly debate about Dumbledore's role in the Potter's death is contentious, he notes, with some historians arguing that he did everything possible to protect them within the constraints of the situation, while others suggest he deliberately undermined their security to ensure Voldemort would successfully attack them, and Dumbledore says honestly that the truth is somewhere between these positions, but probably closer to the second than makes him comfortable. That he didn't actively sabotage their protection, but he didn't try as hard as he could have to make it effective, didn't provide resources he possessed, didn't take precautions he knew would work, because some part of him understood that Harry needed to be orphaned to become what Dumbledore needed him to be, needed to be marked by tragedy to develop the psychological profile required for the role he would eventually play. You ask how he could possibly justify this, how any strategic goal could warrant allowing a child's parents to be murdered, and Dumbledore's answer is the chilling logic of total utilitarianism. The calculus that says individual suffering means nothing against collective benefit. And he explains that Voldemort threatened not just dozens or hundreds of deaths, but potentially the complete destruction of both magical and Muggle societies if left unchecked, that the war Voldemort was waging in 1980 was already devastating, was already killing families weekly, was already tearing apart the fabric of civilization, and the prophecy offered a way to end this, offered a specific mechanism for Voldemort's defeat, and Dumbledore calculated that allowing one family to die in order to activate this mechanism was acceptable arithmetic, was tragic but necessary, was the kind of choice that makes you monstrous but also maybe makes you effective. And you think about how many historical atrocities have been justified through exactly this reasoning, from the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, killing over 200,000 civilians to supposedly save American lives and end World War II faster, which historians like Gar Alperovitz have argued was more about intimidating the Soviet Union than military necessity, to countless other examples where the math of sacrifice has been used to make mass death seem rational. The plan that emerged over the next decade was breathtakingly comprehensive, Dumbledore continues. A plan that required Harry to grow up damaged but not broken, abused but not destroyed, desperate for love but capable of giving it, because Dumbledore needed Harry to develop specific psychological traits that would make him willing to sacrifice himself when the moment came. And placing Harry with the Dursleys wasn't about protection, as he claimed, but about cultivation. About ensuring Harry would grow up feeling unloved and unwanted, would develop a hero complex and a desperate need to prove his worth, would value his friends' lives above his own, would see death as preferable to failing the people who finally gave him belonging. And you realize this is psychological engineering of the most disturbing kind, this deliberate traumatization of a child to make him suitable for sacrifice. You feel genuinely angry now, angry in a way you haven't been during the previous night's confessions, because this feels different, feels worse somehow than Dumbledore's youthful supremacist fantasies or his possession of the Elder Wand. And you tell him this. Tell him that manipulating a child's entire development to make him willing to die is perhaps the most evil thing he's ever done. And Dumbledore doesn't disagree, doesn't try to minimize or defend, just nods and says, yes, it probably is. And if there's justice in the universe, he'll answer for it. But the calculation seemed necessary at the time, and still seems necessary in retrospect, even though recognizing necessity doesn't reduce culpability, doesn't make the choice less monstrous, only makes it more tragic that it seemed unavoidable. The Dursleys were chosen specifically because they would be awful to Harry, Dumbledore admits, because their particular brand of petty cruelty and neglect would produce exactly the psychological profile he needed, would create someone who was fundamentally good despite mistreatment, who valued love specifically because he'd been denied it, who would fight for others because no one fought for him. And Dumbledore monitored Harry's development carefully throughout his childhood, sent Mrs. Fig to observe, checked in periodically through various means, ensuring the abuse stayed within acceptable parameters, harsh enough to shape Harry correctly, but not so severe that it would break him completely or prevent him from functioning at Hogwarts, which is perhaps the most disturbing admission yet, this careful calibration of a child's suffering to achieve strategic goals. Here's another dark joke. You mentioned that most people's childhood trauma is accidental, that usually parents damage their children through ignorance or mental illness, rather than because a powerful wizard deliberately arranged for educational abuse. And Dumbledore says that yes, intentional trauma is probably worse than accidental trauma, that Harry at least has the consolation of knowing his suffering served a purpose, even though that consolation is probably worthless compared to having had a normal childhood. And you think about how Dumbledore is describing Harry's entire life as an experiment in weaponization, as a long-term project in creating a tool that looks like a boy. The Hogwarts years were equally calculated, Dumbledore continues. Every challenge Harry faced was something Dumbledore either arranged or allowed to happen. From the Philosopher's Stone being obviously vulnerable in first year, to the Chamber of Secrets being accessible in second year, to Sirius Black, supposedly being able to infiltrate the castle in third year, and each of these situations was designed to test Harry, to build his skills, to develop his courage and his willingness to sacrifice for others, to incrementally prepare him for the final confrontation that Dumbledore knew was coming. And you realize that Hogwarts itself became a training ground, a controlled environment where danger could be introduced in measured doses, where Harry's hero complex could be reinforced through success, where he could learn that sacrificing himself saves others and is therefore the right choice when circumstances demand it. The philosophical question this raises is whether you can truly call someone's choices free when their entire life has been engineered to produce those specific choices, Dumbledore notes. Whether Harry's eventual willingness to die to save others represents genuine moral agency or just successful conditioning, and this is something Dumbledore himself isn't certain about. Something that troubles him because if Harry's sacrifice wasn't freely chosen, then Dumbledore is simply a murderer who used elaborate psychological manipulation instead of direct violence. But if it was freely chosen, then somehow the manipulation didn't destroy Harry's agency, which is possible, but doesn't make the manipulation less wrong, just makes the outcome less deterministic. And you think about how philosophy and ethics struggle with questions of free will and determinism, how Immanuel Kant argued that moral actions only count if they're freely chosen rather than coerced, but also how modern psychology suggests that free will might be less free than we'd like to believe, that our choices are shaped by countless factors we don't consciously control, making the boundary between influence and manipulation fuzzy at best. You ask about specific incidents, about whether Dumbledore knew Voldemort would possess Quirrell in first year, and Dumbledore admits he suspected and allowed it to happen because Harry needed to face Voldemort, needed that early confrontation to understand what he was up against, needed the confidence that comes from surviving such an encounter. And yes, it was dangerous. Harry could have died. But calculated risk was necessary to the project, and you realize every time Harry nearly died at Hogwarts was, at least partially intentional, was Dumbledore running an experiment in exactly how much danger Harry could survive, exactly how far he could push Harry's courage and luck without killing him prematurely. The Chamber of Secrets incident in second year was particularly useful, Dumbledore says, because it taught Harry that he was connected to Voldemort, taught him about Horcruxes without explicitly revealing what Horcruxes were, planted seeds that would be necessary for later revelations. And Dumbledore could have prevented Ginny Weasley's possession more easily, but chose not to, because Harry needed to experience saving someone through sacrifice, needed to establish the pattern that would culminate in his final choice, needed to begin understanding that his connection to Voldemort was both curse and weapon. And you feel sick again thinking about Ginny being used as a prop in Dumbledore's elaborate staging of Harry's moral education. Think about how many people's suffering was instrumentalized in service of this grand plan. Third year's revelation about Sirius Black was another carefully orchestrated lesson. Dumbledore continues, another opportunity for Harry to learn about trust and betrayal and the complexity of good and evil. And Dumbledore knew Sirius was innocent, but allowed the situation to play out because Harry needed to experience moral ambiguity, needed to learn that the world wasn't simple, that the people who seemed dangerous might be allies and the people who seemed safe might be threats. And this prepared him for later revelations about Snape, about Dumbledore himself, about the compromises required in war. And you realize that even Harry's relationship with his godfather was managed, was controlled, was part of the curriculum. The quirky historical detail here is that the Triwizard Tournament, which Dumbledore allowed to be reinstated at Hogwarts despite knowing it was dangerous, had previously been discontinued in 1792 after a particularly disastrous incident involving a cockatrice that killed all three school heads, and reviving it after over a century specifically so that Harry could be illegally entered and forced to compete, demonstrates Dumbledore's willingness to risk not just Harry's life, but the lives of all participating students in service of his strategic goals. And you think about how institutions often repeat historical mistakes when the people making decisions aren't the ones who will suffer the consequences. Much like how military generals throughout history have ordered charges and offensives that they knew would kill thousands of soldiers, like General Douglas Haig's tactics during World War I's Battle of the Somme in 1916, where British forces suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day alone, decisions that historians like Gordon Corrigan argue made sense strategically, even though they were catastrophic for individual soldiers. Fourth year was the turning point, Dumbledore explains, because Voldemort returned to physical form using Harry's blood, and Dumbledore saw this happen and felt triumph rather than horror because Voldemort's choice to use Harry's blood in his resurrection created the magical connection that would eventually allow Harry to survive his own death. And Dumbledore understood this immediately. Understood that Harry was now simultaneously more endangered and more essential, that the path to victory was becoming clearer and more terrible. And he began preparing Harry more directly for the sacrifice that would be required, began teaching him occlumency through Snape, began revealing information about Horcruxes, began the process of making Harry understand that he himself was a Horcrux, that his own death was necessary to make Voldemort mortal again. You interrupt to ask about Snape, about whether Snape knew the full plan, and Dumbledore's expression becomes complicated as he explains that yes, Snape knew. Snape understood exactly what Dumbledore was doing to Harry and participated anyway, because Snape's love for Lily Potter made him willing to do anything that might avenge her death, even if it meant sacrificing her son. And this makes Snape's antagonism toward Harry throughout the school years even more disturbing, because Snape was bullying and undermining a child he knew was being groomed for death, was making Harry's life harder specifically to strengthen him through adversity, was himself a tool in Dumbledore's program of controlled traumatization. And you think about how many adults failed Harry, how many people knew he was being used and said nothing, did nothing, participated in his manipulation. The Horcrux revelation was staged carefully, Dumbledore continues, with lessons about Voldemort's past designed to help Harry understand why Voldemort split his soul, how to find the remaining Horcruxes, and eventually, in a moment that Dumbledore orchestrated specifically for maximum impact, that Harry himself was the final Horcrux, that part of Voldemort's soul lived in Harry's scar, that Harry couldn't truly live while Voldemort survived, that Harry's death was necessary to make Voldemort mortal and therefore defeatable. And Dumbledore waited until Harry had developed sufficient courage and moral commitment to accept this information, waited until Harry loved his friends enough to die for them, waited until the psychological conditioning was complete. Here's a joke, though. Calling it a joke feels increasingly inappropriate. You mentioned that usually when someone says they're training a student, they mean teaching them skills and helping them develop, not conditioning them to accept their own death as necessary and good. And Dumbledore says that traditional education does seem less fatal. And you can hear the self-hatred in his voice, can hear that he knows exactly how monstrous this all sounds. Knows that no strategic justification truly excuses treating a child as a disposable tool. And yet he did it anyway because the alternative seemed worse, because allowing Voldemort to win seemed to guarantee even more deaths, even more suffering, and he chose to sacrifice one innocent person rather than risk thousands of innocent people. Which is the classic trolley problem made horrifyingly real, made personal, made something he actually implemented rather than just theorized about. The question of whether Harry truly chose to die, or whether his entire life conditioned him toward that choice, is something Dumbledore struggles with. he admits. Because if Harry's agency was real, then Dumbledore's manipulation doesn't completely negate Harry's heroism. But if Harry's choice was deterministically produced by Dumbledore's engineering, then Harry was simply a victim who never had a chance to be anything else. And Dumbledore genuinely doesn't know which is true. Suspects the answer is somewhere in between. That Harry was influenced but not controlled, shaped but not determined, guided but not forced, and even if Harry retains some measure of free choice, that doesn't absolve Dumbledore of responsibility for creating conditions where that choice seemed necessary, where death seemed like Harry's only viable option. You ask if there was really no other way to defeat Voldemort, whether this elaborate multi-year manipulation of a child's psychology was truly the only strategy available, and Dumbledore pauses for a long time before answering. Long enough that you wonder if perhaps he's never directly confronted this question, and finally he says, no. There were other possibilities, other strategies that might have worked, but they were riskier or slower or less certain, and he chose the path that seemed most likely to succeed. Even though it required sacrifice, he had no right to demand from anyone, let alone from a child who never asked to be involved in this war, never asked to be chosen by prophecy, never asked for the burden of being the wizarding world's designated savior. And you realize that Dumbledore's great sin wasn't that he made the only possible choice, but that he made a choice among several options and selected the one that required someone else to pay the price. The relationship between Dumbledore and Harry that developed over the years was itself manipulative, Dumbledore continues, because he deliberately cultivated Harry's trust and affection, deliberately positioned himself as a mentor and surrogate grandfather, deliberately made Harry care about his good opinion, all so that when the moment came to reveal Harry's necessary death, Harry would trust that Dumbledore was right, would believe this sacrifice was truly necessary, would accept his fate, rather than running or fighting or looking for alternatives. And this exploitation of emotional connection for strategic purposes might be the cruelest aspect of the entire plan, because it transformed love itself into a weapon, made Harry's capacity for attachment into a vulnerability that Dumbledore could exploit. The scholarly debate about whether Dumbledore's strategy was justified centers on consequentialist versus deontological ethics, he explains, dropping into lecture mode perhaps because it's easier than sitting with the emotional weight of what he's describing. And he outlines how consequentialists argue that outcomes matter more than means, that if Dumbledore's strategy led to Voldemort's defeat with minimal overall casualties, then it was correct regardless of the moral status of individual actions along the way, while deontologists argue that certain actions are inherently wrong regardless of consequences, that treating people as mere means rather than ends in themselves violates fundamental ethical principles, that manipulating and sacrificing a child is wrong even if it saves thousands of other people, and Dumbledore says he spent decades trying to determine which framework is correct and has concluded that probably both are partially right and neither provides full answer to the moral status of his choices. As this final section moves toward its conclusion, toward the gentle wind down that will end these 4 nights of confession, you watch Dumbledore's face and see something like relief there, relief at having finally spoken truths he's carried alone for so long, and he tells you that Harry survived his own death through magical technicalities involving the Elder Wand's allegiance and Voldemort's use of Harry's blood, survived in ways that Dumbledore calculated but couldn't guarantee, which meant his entire plan rested on probabilities rather than certainties, meant he risked Harry's permanent death for a strategy that was sophisticated but not foolproof. And the fact that it worked doesn't retrospectively justify the risk, doesn't make the gamble less reckless, only makes the outcome less catastrophic than it might have been. Harry forgave him, Dumbledore says quietly, or at least claimed to forgive him, told Dumbledore's portrait after the war that he understood why these choices were made, that he accepted the necessity even while hating the manipulation. But Dumbledore isn't certain this forgiveness is earned or deserved, isn't certain Harry truly understands how completely his life was orchestrated. How little of his own story belonged to him rather than to Dumbledore's strategic vision. And you think about how forgiveness from victims might sometimes be more about their own need to move forward than about the perpetrator's actual worthiness of forgiveness. How people often absolve those who hurt them, simply because carrying anger and resentment is exhausting, because moving on requires releasing grievances whether or not they've been adequately addressed. The question that remains is whether someone who has done what Dumbledore did can be called good in any meaningful sense, he continues, whether his later restraint and careful ethics constitute redemption for earlier manipulation and sacrifice, whether the fact that his strategy worked and saved lives balances against the moral horror of how that strategy treated individuals as expendable pieces in a larger game, and Dumbledore honestly doesn't know, suspects the answer might be that he's simply a person who did both terrible and necessary things, who made choices that were simultaneously monstrous and unavoidable, who tried to be better than his worst self while never quite succeeding, who spent his entire life trying to atone for his youthful supremacist fantasies by fighting supremacy, but ended up treating people almost as instrumentally as his supremacist ideology would have, just with different justifications and perhaps slightly better intentions. You realize as dawn approaches once again that these 4 nights have been about more than just Dumbledore's personal history, have been about the fundamental question of whether anyone can be trusted with power, whether good intentions matter when consequences harm people, whether the distance between savior and monster is just a matter of which side you're standing on, whether redemption is possible, or whether past sins simply accumulate until they outweigh any subsequent good, and these questions don't have clean answers, don't resolve into comfortable conclusions. Instead, they sit there demanding attention, demanding acknowledgement that morality might be more ambiguous than we want to believe, that the people we celebrate as heroes might be complicated and compromised and deeply flawed in ways that don't negate their accomplishments, but do complicate any simple assessment of their character. Dumbledore mentions one final quirky detail as the conversation winds toward its end, which is that his portrait in the headmaster's office was painted before his death specifically so he could continue advising future heads, which means his self-awareness of his own manipulative tendencies was sufficient that he arranged to keep influencing events even after dying, which could be read either as admirable dedication to protecting students or as a final expression of the controlling behavior that characterized his entire approach to leadership, and probably it's both simultaneously. Probably most significant actions contain these contradictions, these simultaneous goods and harms that resist simple categorization. The final lesson Dumbledore draws from his life is that no one should be trusted with absolute power. Not because people are fundamentally evil, but because power removes the constraints that make goodness possible, that being good requires limitations and accountability, and the possibility of being wrong requires other people who can check your decisions and challenge your reasoning and prevent you from rationalizing away concerns that should matter, and this is why he never took the position of Minister of Magic, why he operated primarily as a teacher and advisor rather than direct ruler, why he kept the Elder Wand but didn't use it, because he understood that he specifically could not be trusted with unchecked authority, that his intelligence and good intentions would not prevent him from doing terrible things if given the power to do them, that wisdom includes recognizing your own capacity for corruption and building structures to prevent it. As these confessions drift toward their close, as the morning light strengthens through the office windows, and another school day prepares to begin, you feel the weight of everything you've heard settle into something approaching understanding. Not approval or forgiveness necessarily, but at least comprehension of how someone can simultaneously be hero and villain, protector and manipulator, wise teacher and destructive narcissist. And you think that perhaps the truth about people is that we contain multitudes, that we're all capable of both nobility and monstrosity, that circumstances and choices and luck determine which potentials we actualize, and that acknowledging this doesn't excuse harm, but does make clear that simple narratives of good versus evil miss most of what matters about human complexity. Dumbledore looks ancient now in the morning light, looks not just physically old but spiritually exhausted, looks like someone who has carried too much for too long and is finally, slowly, carefully setting down burdens that were never really his to carry alone. And you understand that these confessions have served some purpose for him, have provided some release of pressure, have transformed private guilt into shared knowledge. Even though sharing changes nothing material about what happened, and you think that perhaps confession matters not because it provides absolution, but because it prevents secrets from festering in isolation, because speaking truth aloud makes it real in ways that silent knowledge never quite achieves, because being witnessed in our worst moments is somehow different from being alone with them, more bearable, or perhaps just more honest, more aligned with what it means to be fully human, with all the contradictions that entails. The portraits on the walls are quiet now. Even Phineas Nigellus has nothing sharp to say, and you realize they've heard all of this before in fragments and hints, but perhaps never assembled into complete narrative, perhaps never laid out with such brutal honesty. And you wonder what it means that even painted versions of past headmasters seem subdued by the weight of these revelations, seem to recognize that they're witnessing something significant, even if its significance is simply acknowledgement that the person they thought they knew was more complicated and compromised than they had understood, more damaged and damaging than his public persona suggested, more carefully constructed mask over barely controlled chaos than the serene, wise mentor that students and colleagues saw. And now, as this long night's conversation moves toward its necessary ending, as your time in this office, full of silver instruments and sleeping portraits, draws to a close, you feel yourself growing tired in a way that has nothing to do with physical exhaustion and everything to do with the weight of knowledge you didn't ask for but now possess, knowledge that makes simple admiration impossible, but perhaps makes something more valuable possible, something like genuine understanding. Understanding that accounts for failure and compromise and the daily struggle to be better than your worst impulses. Understanding that recognizes that people are works in progress even at 150 years old. That redemption is less a destination than a direction, less something achieved than something attempted over and over, despite repeated failures, despite knowing that your best efforts will never fully repair the harm you've caused, will never make right what you've made wrong, will at best prevent some future harms while carrying forever the guilt of past ones. The conversation is ending now, winding down like a spell slowly losing power, and Dumbledore seems both relieved and bereft, seems grateful you listened, but also aware that nothing has actually changed. That tomorrow he'll wake to the same memories and the same guilt and the same daily choice to try to be better while knowing he'll never succeed completely. And you realize this is perhaps the most human thing about him, this persistence in the face of futility. This continued effort to act ethically despite knowing that his capacity for rationalization remains intact, that circumstances might arise where he makes terrible choices again. That vigilance is required forever because there is no point at which you finally become good enough to relax, no achievement that grants permanent moral immunity, no number of right choices that erase the possibility of wrong ones. You stand to leave, and Dumbledore doesn't try to stop you, doesn't ask where you'll go with this knowledge, doesn't request promises of secrecy or understanding, seems to simply accept that stories, once told, have their own lives, their own trajectories, their own ways of mattering or not mattering to those who hear them. And you walk toward the door thinking about how everyone carries secrets that would change how they're perceived if known, how everyone has made choices they regret, how everyone struggles with the gap between who they want to be and who they actually are. And maybe the difference between Dumbledore and most people isn't that his secrets are darker, but simply that his position made his choices more consequential, made his failures affect more people, made his internal struggles matter beyond just himself because people depended on him, looked to him, trusted him to make decisions that would protect them rather than harm them even when harm seemed necessary. For some greater goal, the door to the headmaster's office closes behind you and you realize you're carrying something now, carrying the weight of stories that don't resolve cleanly, that don't offer comfortable morals or simple lessons, that instead sit heavy and uncomfortable, demanding that you think about power and responsibility and the terrible ease with which good intentions curdle into rationalized cruelty, and you walk down the spiral staircase away from that office full of secrets and portraits and accumulated regrets. Walk back toward the ordinary concerns of ordinary life, but you're changed now. Understand more than you did about how complicated people can be, how much darkness can coexist with light, how the same person can be both savior and destroyer, depending on perspective and circumstance, and you carry this understanding with you as you walk through corridors growing lighter with morning, corridors that have witnessed a century of Dumbledore's careful control and occasional failures. Corridors that will continue witnessing long after everyone involved in these stories is gone. Long after the specific details fade into simplified myth that makes heroes purely heroic and villains purely villainous. Long after the truth becomes just another story. People tell themselves to make sense of complicated legacies that resist simple interpretation.